Today we're gonna talk about some of the aspects of cultural or media imperialism, and I will talk with you about some of the research I've done in this area to kind of bring things around so you can see how that it works practically with regards to um, communication research. So this is your textbook, and in your textbook it says this statement: what may seem like harmless and frivolous entertainment actually disseminates core U.S. cultural values such as individualism, personal freedom, and consumerism around the globe. Through the distribution and consumption of U.S. popular culture globally, particular culture views on gender norms and gender relationships, sex, sexuality, and violence, as well as racial stereotypes and intercultural relations, are normalized. So, this notion of entertainment being just entertainment, right? It loses some of that understanding when we think about how entertainment can promote certain ideologies and ideas as it gets sent around the world. Again, I want to then talk a little bit about this paragraph here, right? It says cultural corruption refers to the perceived and experienced alteration of a culture in negative or detrimental ways through the influence of other cultures. Cultural homogenization is the convergence towards common cultural values and practices as a result of cultural integration. So that cultures all kind of start seeming the same because you have more and more integration between different groups. And cultural imperialism is the domination of one culture over others through cultural forms such as popular culture, media, and cultural products. All three objections, cultural corruption, cultural homogenization, and cultural imperialism, focus on the dominance today of U.S. popular culture globally and the potentially significant ways this dominance may contribute to the loss, change, or undermining of national and local cultural practices, values, and identities. Okay, so we see that clearly the book presents that as a problem. And we want to talk a little bit about now how this actually looks in practice. So I'm going to talk with you about some of the research I've done with regards to cultural imperialism, in this sense, media imperialism. So this is a chapter that we wrote in the book, Popular Television in Eastern Europe During and Since Socialism, and this was published in 2012. The article, or the chapter, is entitled Intra-European Media Imperialism, Hungarian Program Imports, and the Television Without Frontiers Directive. So, what is the Television Without Frontiers Directive? Well, it was passed in 1989, and it was passed in the European Union. So the European Union, right, the separate individual European countries joining together to create a more unified body so that they could compete with the larger unified bodies such as the United States of America and other larger countries. So that there are other larger bodies of groups that work together, so that the European Union said we don't, these individual small countries don't really have the power that they need to have, so we need to operate as a unified body. So the Television Without Frontiers Directive was geared towards the goal of creating a unified European television market, right? So they said, well, if we are, if we think of it as, we want to look more like the U.S., we need a unified market, and so that our products will be distributed, right? So we'll supply broadcasters with culturally relevant programming to replace imported American programs, because prior to this time, in all of these small countries, and Hungary being one of those small countries, most of you had some local broadcasting, but a lot of the broadcasting were syndicated American shows. So in a sense, the Television Without Frontiers Directive was intended, or yes, we'll say intended to stop media imperialism from the sense of an American standpoint of media imperialism, right? So it changed the model from national markets to free. So, like, think about. I guess the easiest way for you to think about it is if Arkansas was its own market, and Tennessee was its own market, and Missouri was its own market, and Oklahoma was its own market, and Louisiana was its own market, and Texas was its own market, and that all of those were individual markets. There wasn't a unified U.S. television market, right? So we have large U.S. broadcasters. We have NBC and ABC and CBS and Fox, and we have the cable broadcast markets. We have all of these different national markets. So the idea was to have a national market instead of, to have a European market as opposed to these individual national markets. And it was a reaction to the dominance of U.S.-based cultural exports, right? They wanted to construct a collective European identity. So they do this directive, and they say, we want to be able to open up markets, but we want to be able to open up markets for all of these European products to distribute within the overall European market. So with regard to, we can talk, and the book talks about some of this, but from our article, this is some of the data that we have, right? American television accounts for nearly 70% of all worldwide trade in television programs. And again, as the book says, we send a lot out, we don't bring a lot in. We don't bring in a lot of programming from other countries. We send a lot of programming out. Part of that is because, of course, America is not good at doing things like learning other languages, and we're kind of isolated from the rest of the world. We have Latin American television shows that come in because we have larger Latin American populations, but we don't have a lot of stuff coming in from other areas. Where we do have that now is there can be selective cable programming. So if you come from certain areas around the world, you can get selective cable programming for your area, but for the larger broadcasting area of the U.S., we don't bring in a lot of other programs from other areas. Their trade deficit hovers around $7 billion per year, so we send out more, right, obviously, than we bring in, but $7 billion more than we bring in. The Television Without Frontiers Directive, right, was eventually renamed the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. I'm not exactly sure why they made that switch, but they did make that switch. Member states shall ensure, this is what it reads, right? Member states shall ensure where practicable and by appropriate means that broadcasters reserve for European works within the meaning of Article 6 a majority proportion of their transmission time, excluding the time appointed to news, sports events, games, advertising, teletext services, and teleshopping, right? So they want to be able to have a situation where they're working with reserving a significant amount of time for European programming, as opposed to American programming. To a large extent, for the rest of the world, this also would respond to programming from Bollywood, from India, because as the book says, the Bollywood sends a lot of programming around the world as well. But America is by far the dominant. So what are the results of our study? So we compared television imports in Hungary from the 1980s, which was before the Television Without Frontiers Directive, and the 2000s, which was after the Television Frontier Directive, right? That directive was done in 1989, so it gave it enough time to really be able to start fully functioning. So we compared the times before it was passed and time after it was passed, but not immediately, but a little bit of time, so it was able to kind of get fully up to speed. Now, here's the interesting thing, right? The U.S. has gone from 11.5% programming in those area in Hungary to 57.3% of programming. So the percentage of imports, the U.S. imports, has actually gone up dramatically during this time. The amount of broadcast time has quadrupled, though. So it's not to say that there's just a lot more time to broadcast. So imports from most Western countries went up with respect to the total amount. So a lot of Western, and when we say Western countries, we can mean obviously Hungary is in Eastern Europe, but Western Europe are things like England, right, France, Germany, those types of Western European countries. So and the U.S. is considered a Western country. So that the programming from those areas, it just went up dramatically because the amount of broadcast time went up. Television Without Frontiers has fostered a one-way cultural dialogue between Hungary and other European nations with large commercial industries. So the goal was to say, well, if we do this, we'll create this European market. But again, when you talk about these individual countries, the smaller countries actually are not really participating in in sending out cultural products and creating their own cultural products. Now they're just taking the large Western European countries' products in. So not only are they bringing in more American products, but they're also bringing in more English products and products from the other larger European countries like France and Germany. So in that sense, it just opens the door for more cultural imperialism from larger, more powerful countries. There was a clear decrease in program imports from other nations in Central and Eastern Europe. So before, there was actually more programming in Central and Eastern Europe being imported to these other larger Western European countries, and now that's not happening. In fact, there's more media imperialism within the European Union itself, in the sense of the more powerful countries sending their cultural products to the less powerful countries. So you can see that even though there was a goal here to reduce cultural imperialism, that the actual directive itself created more cultural imperialism. And Western ideals, right, American ideals, are really the same as Western European ideals, because remember, we can talk about, there's a tendency in the book to talk about, and there's a tendency around in many places to talk about white America and some other type of America, or, and really we shouldn't be talking about things in those terms. The terms we should be using is European American, right, which is really Western European American, and other American, right? So Latin American, African American, influences that come from other regions, right, that have a firm background in other regions. So that we want to think of it that way, in the sense of a Western European influence, right? Because that's really what fuels the ideology, American ideology, Euro-American ideology, is really the thinking that comes from Western Europe. And so we want to think about that, and we want to understand that in those ways, so that it makes it more sensible that we're not thinking of our relationship as like a race relationship, in the sense of by color of skin, as much as a relationship that's based on kind of the root ideology that individuals came from. So whether it's Native American, whether it's African American, whether it's European American, that there's something about the root ideology of all these areas that influences people's cultural behavior. So in this sense, when we talk about this notion of media imperialism, we're saying, it's American programming, it's really Western programming. And that Western programming has the same ideology that we would see in American programming, the same individualism, right? We'll go back to the that section of the book where it says disseminates U.S. cultural values such as individualism, personal freedom, and consumerism, right? Those really aren't U.S. cultural values. Those are Western cultural values. Individualism, personal freedom, and consumerism, right? Those are Western ideas in the sense of Western European, really, was what we talk about. And so when we think of, instead of saying U.S. cultural values, we should really be saying something along the lines of Euro-American cultural values. Right. So hopefully that's helpful. You know, I'm hoping that by showing you actually how research in these areas is conducted and the findings of research in these areas conducted, it can make things a little bit more real to you in the sense of understanding, oh, wait a minute, there really is, this stuff really does happen, and you can do research and find out how these are done. Now, I will tell you how we did this particular research was that what we did was we reviewed the television programming for those different periods. And the way we reviewed the television program is we actually went through their kind of version of a TV guide and said what programs were on. We coded those programs as different types of programs and then had people go through stacks and stacks and stacks of these texts to be able to then code each one as a specific type of program. So from a region, the type of program it was, so was it a Western, was it a romance, was it a detective story, whatever the case was, we had them determine all of these factors, right? And then we were able to then come up with data based on that. So hopefully this was helpful for you to be able to understand kind of the role of cultural imperialism. But again, I want you to also start stressing this notion of moving the discussion from race as in color to talking about things like influence, ideological influence. So a Euro-American ideology, a Native American ideology, a Latin American ideology, African American ideology, and then start looking for those types of distinctions. For instance, I've put up a link for that to kind of give you some information about the first major assignment, because some of you in your reading of it tended to have this understanding that Coral mispronounced a word, right? That means that what we're working from right then is a Euro-American ideology in the sense of what is correct dialect. But if you look at that reading, you'll see that there were points over time where choices were made with regards to dialect, and even Old English would use the ax dialect as opposed to the ask dialect. And so in that sense that we've made decisions, and those decisions have been based on power, not necessarily anything about what is correct or what's incorrect. Just certain things have been able to exert their sense of this is how we say this. And so I want you to be able to, look at that and kind of be clear about, again, how we make these moves within culture. These moves are based in power, but they aren't necessarily what is naturally right or what is naturally wrong. They're just what culture has been able to exert their understanding as the dominant understanding. Thanks. Have a great day. You have an assignment coming up. Please respond to, look at my responses. I'm working more and more to get everything graded for you, and I'll do that as I move forward. I'm taking my time to be able to do that grading so that you have good, effective responses, so that you can take those responses to move forward for ongoing assignments. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.